Denise, great to see you. My pleasure is to get to introduce Denise Anderson. Denise and I have known each other for many years. She is, we spent a lot of time working common issues together, and Denise is going to facilitate this panel. It's really going to look at using lessons learned from 2021 to overcome threats. So Denise is the president of the Health Information Sharing and Analysis, ISAC, right? A nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting the health sector from physical and cyber attacks and incidents through dissemination of trusted, underlined trusted and timely information. Denise is one of those people that has a great network. There's very few people Denise knows, and she and I laugh about many of the councils we're on together. We get a chance to share a lot of information with each other and afterthoughts, thing like that. So Denise, thanks so much for pulling this panel together. Again, you did this last year. It was fantastic. We had a lot of great feedback. Looking forward to today. So let me introduce Denise Anderson. Denise, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Always good to see you and delighted to be here. So we have an esteemed panel today. We're going to be talking about using lessons learned in 2021 to help overcome threats. And we have Eugene Kipnis, who's the Acting Director of Partnerships and Federal Program Engagement at Multi-State ISAC. We have Brandon Brucker, Director of Exercise Programs at the Financial Services ISAC, and Courtney Romolt, Programs Manager at Healthcare Ready. And basically, we're going to be talking a little bit about the various cyber and physical incidents that have happened in 2021 and the lessons learned that we've taken away from that, as well as how information sharing plays a role in helping critical infrastructure owners and operators remain resilient and operationally sound. So I'm going to start off by having each of the panelists kind of introduce themselves and give a little bit of a overview of their role within their organization and the role of their organization. So I'm going to start with Eugene. Eugene?
Thank you very much, Denise. Glad to be here, and thank you to the All Hazards Consortium for hosting this great panel. I'm really excited to participate. My name is Eugene Kipnis, and I'm the Director of Partnerships and Stakeholder Maturity here at the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, where we also have the Elections Infrastructure ISAC also housed. And so my role is really to work with our sector partners throughout the state, local, tribal, and territorial communities and elections communities. And a lot of that is working with the associations and groups that serve them, recently forging partnerships. But I also work on cyber assessment programs and analyzing what the areas of maturity and lack of maturity are in our community through a self-assessment program called the Nationwide Cybersecurity Review. And as a whole, the MS-ISAC, the Multi-State ISAC, and the Elections Infrastructure ISAC, we are cybersecurity focused ISACs. We are funded by the Department of Homeland Security's CISA under a cooperative agreement to serve public sector entities. And we do collaborate a lot with partners in private sector, and we also collaborate with partners at other ISACs as well. We do everything from providing intelligence and information sharing in a lot of traditional roles, but also some funded service provision and discounted service provision of security services that help mitigate threats. We provide intellectual products and best practices and guidance, and publish a lot of materials to help get people up to speed on cybersecurity within our community. With that, I'll hand things back to Denise. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Eugene. Next, we'll have Brandon talk. So Brandon.
Hi, Denise, thanks. Let me come up on camera here. Hi, so my name is Brandon Brucker. I'm with the FS-ISAC. I'm the director of the exercise programs there. So most people know ISACs do a lot of things, chief among those intelligence sharing, of course, but we also have this group that looks at sort of larger resilience efforts. And part of that is our exercise program. Sorry for this crazy light coming in here from the side. What we do there is primarily we do a lot of coordination across the sector and even with other sectors. That's a big part of how we operate to improve sort of the overall resilience of our sector. So, for example, we participate with the sector coordinating councils, so the Financial Services Sector Coordinating Council. We work with them. That's really a public-private partnership, or we have on the exercise committee there at the FISIC, we have public sector partners, regulators, treasury, et cetera, who come in and help us. And we look through, what are the big issues, big problems across the sector that we want to address. And how do we do that through exercises, drills, things like that? So we work together to do that. In fact, just got off a call with those folks a little bit ago to do that. So that's a big part of how we look at our resilience is of course, cooperating across sector and that public-private partnership piece, which I'm sure we'll get to later as well. So I look after that. We also have a fairly robust cyber range program here that's focused on our members, in particular our small to mid-sized members, take advantage of that cyber range program. There aren't a lot of opportunities to find those cyber ranges out there, specifically focused on the financial services sector. So that's something that we offer. We offer some training as well, online training for cyber, things like that to help our small to mid-sized member cyber defenders improve their skills. So those are just some of the programs that I oversee. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Denise.
Great, thanks, Brandon. And Courtney?
Yep, hello and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Courtney Rommel. I'm the programs manager at Healthcare Ready. Also really grateful to be here with fellow members of the National Council of ISACs, and thanks to All Hazards Consortium for hosting. As programs manager, my team works primarily on critical healthcare infrastructure, resilience, including supply chain, as well as public-private partnership. And as far as some background on our organization, we were founded by members of the healthcare supply chain following Hurricane Katrina, largely due to the recognition of a need for additional or better coordination and communication between public sector response organizations, so public health and emergency management, and then private sector healthcare, to ultimately ensure continuity of patient care. So we leverage relationships with government, nonprofits, as well as supply chain stakeholders to build and enhance the resilience of communities. We do that from preparedness to response, serving as a linkage point for the health sector and government partners at the federal, state, and local levels. Our goal is to facilitate planning and response coordination that improves our ability to respond to threats that disrupt patient access to healthcare during crises. Like I was saying, this goes for all points along the supply chain, with the recognition that all of these pieces are ultimately working toward the one goal of patient and more broadly community health. So as one of the healthcare and public health sector ISACs, information sharing and analysis is a large part of our mission and how we work toward resilience of supply chains and of communities. We focus primarily on preparedness and response to physical threats, so including natural disasters, chemical, biorad, nuke, physical impacts of cybersecurity threats, while our counterparts at the HISAC lead the charge on cybersecurity itself. In terms of our emergency response operations in 2021, we activated our Emergency Operations Center for 27 distinct events during the year, including, of course, COVID-19. And we've been activated for COVID-19 since January 2020. So over the last year, really 2 years, we've answered or routed hundreds of requests for information from private, public, and nonprofit organizations, and have done a significant amount of coordination across sectors, organizing calls, making introductions between contacts, for response and preparedness activities. So excited to talk about some of the lessons learned from those many events over the past year, and discuss with these panelists. So back to you, Denise.
Great, thanks, Courtney. And so I thought I would just mention really quickly too, you've heard a couple times and you saw Sarah dropped in the chat there, the National Council of ISACs. There are 27 members of the National Council of ISACs, and we cross the gamut of the critical infrastructure sectors and subsectors. And you can learn more about us if you go to the website that, as Sarah mentioned in the chat, and you could see the various ISAC partners that are involved. We work very heavily together. We meet monthly, and we also interact when there's an incident. We are very closely aligned and trying to make sure that we're all working together across the critical infrastructure to make sure that our owners and operators within our various sectors are able to remain resilient, which is the topic of today. So I'm going to start off with a general question just to get us started, and that is, what are some of the top issues and concerns in your sector? And Eugene, you have a little bit of a nuance. You have multi-state and the elections infrastructure. So if you want to go ahead and start with that, that would be great.
Yeah, glad to. So I guess some of the challenges that I see from the multi-state side, which is just the non-elections government side below the federal level. One thing I saw persistently in data that we collected was a lack of staffing was a huge deal for a lot of smaller governments. Like not even having a single security person. I'll talk a little bit about the maturity impact there later if we get the chance. But they also had, as a result, a need for tools and services that were like minimal touch. If you can hand somebody a golden tool that requires an educated staff member and they don't have that person, it's not a great gift in the end. So that's a challenge that we worked through. Another thing I saw was a persistent low level of cyber maturity when it came to managing supply chain risk. From just like we're cyber only, so it was really just from that cyber perspective I can only speak to, but not having formal programs to assess vendors and things like that and manage purchasing from a secure perspective, that's continued. And then also, I guess on the election side, I would say that there's a lot of talk and buzz about misinformation and disinformation management. The talk about getting people together for coordinated vulnerability disclosure or vulnerability disclosure programs. So those are some areas of where there could be some deficiency and room for growth and improvement and resilience.
Great, thank you. How about you, Brandon? I think you're on mute.
Apologies. Thanks. So yeah, we basically stood up a group that was a public-private partnership that has been working for about the last 16 months. It shut down briefly and it's back up again with Omicron. But this is sort of a COVID group where we brought together interested parties throughout the financial services sector, public sector, partners, et cetera, got together, and it could be CISA and others, thinking through what were the challenges or what are the challenges at hand in the sector and writ large that we can address. Some of the things that I heard Eugene mention were some of the things on our mind as well. Issues obviously in the financial services sector, the third-party provider or service provider issue is always a big one. We're only as strong as our core service provider. So there are always concerns with how they're faring and how that's going. So to that end, we've created a couple of programs to help our members sort of navigate that, how to find those parties and how to do that assessment in an efficient way. So I would say that that's a big one. Also, just the typical, I would say in many ways, our sector was fairly well positioned in the sense that much of what we do is online anyway. So that remote, having to go remote wasn't as impactful perhaps on our sector, though it did have a large impact, but as many, we had public facing websites, et cetera, where people can do a lot of their transactions. So we were able to weather some of that storm, though at the smaller institution level, also there are a lot of problems. People can't get into their financial institutions and do their regular transactions. So that was a challenge and something that we tended to talk about a lot on those calls and how to deal with those. So those are some of the challenges that we were able to address. I don't know that we solved all of them, but we were able to, I think, help our members with many of those by bringing in the correct parties to help us from outside. Public-private partnership, again, being really key for this one.
Great, thanks. How about you, Courtney?
Yeah, I think I'm going to double down on a few of those concerns, which I mean, I think we're seeing are just systemic across the world right now, and specifically misinformation or information in general, just the amount of information, especially for healthcare and public health, where you're taking information in as members of the public, but also having to understand not executive orders. Well, that's one too, but emergency use authorizations, if you're a provider, what you're able to provide to a patient, in addition to what you're taking in as, can I go into work today because I'm vaccinated, but I got a positive test and it's been 5 days. I think those kinds of things, in terms of clarity around information, are still something that we struggle with. I think that we're working toward improving it. I think that misinformation just kind of builds on top of that, both misinformation due to malicious actors, as well as just folks that might not be informed and are sharing information. So I think that's especially the case for smaller organizations that might not have full teams to work on kind of working through all of the deluge really of information that's coming in. And I want to highlight that I think that's part of how ISACs are incredibly important, and something that we all work to do is kind of sift through all of this information that's coming in, take out what's the most important for our stakeholders, and then sharing that back to them. So I wanted to double down kind of on the information piece in general, as well as workforce issues. And I think healthcare in particular is seeing this. I know there's been a lot of reporting on the news, of course, just in terms of worker burnout, having to be on the front lines as providers, but also I think in terms of distributors and folks who are, delivering the meds and making sure that products get where they need it. I think it is, there's a level of fatigue there, and there is a need to make sure that we can maintain workforce across the supply chain, both in terms of training, in terms of recognition, combating fatigue. So I think, though, I'll say on the flip side of both of these issues, because they are systemic and so widespread, I think there is a lot of opportunity for public-private partnership to contribute to working them. I think that's really probably the only way we're going to work toward mitigating them, because they are so large scale.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to pivot a little bit. Eugene, how do you think organizations have struggled when it's come to cybersecurity in the past year?
Get off mute first. So I talked a little bit about that staffing issue. So I guess I'll drop a little finding that we had for the struggle in cybersecurity was that having a single person, sorry, let me back up here. We have 3,000 organizations roughly that take our cyber self-assessment against the NIST cybersecurity framework. We also ask some other questions about their staffing levels, about practices that they do that are outside of what the framework asks or prescribes, and some key technologies. And so among those 3,000 organizations, we found that on average, having one single person with cyber responsibility was correlated to, on average, a 22% higher level of maturity across all the NIST functions, just looking at the big macro level there. So that's something we've been really trying to push for, is, looking at ways to get things like the federal virtual training environment, which is like online digital professional development opportunities that are free for state and locals and public sector, as well as veterans, like trying to get that in people's hands. Anything that we can do short of hiring someone for people, which is sadly like the end goal should be, they should have someone in that title. People also reported to us, like, other than that lack of staffing, was also emerging tech constantly changing, the increasing sophistication of threats. We saw that a lot. And then we also saw people were reporting, of course, a lack of sufficient funding for cybersecurity activities. So those were some of the areas where we saw the struggles in our community. Of course, we have some bigger organizations, well-funded locals, like, large cities and metros and large counties, some of which are just as well-funded as our states, which are our biggest organizations we work with. I think their struggles are a little different. They're probably more having trouble with securing the expanding digital footprint of their environment through the pandemic, remote work, and things like that. But we have even more basic needs that are pressing at the smaller level. And then the other thing that I would say, I mentioned supply chain security a little earlier. This is like year after year since NIST put that in their framework as a category. We've just seen that to be the lowest scoring area across the board for those smaller organizations, locals, tribes, territories. And, we've tried to put out guidance. We've tried to work with federal guidance and other partners to get together information people can use. But at the end of the day, it's like a nexus between purchasing and cyber and so many other people within an organization to smartly vet your third parties, manage security and information flows, everything like that. A lot of our organizations, unfortunately, at the smaller level aren't at that sophistication level. And as we've seen in the last year and well before that, third-party providers and security risk there can be a cause for major breaches and issues. So.
Great, thanks. Courtney, how has the healthcare supply chain been tested in the last year, and how has it remained resilient?
Sure. So I think the short answer is quite a bit, but like other sectors, of course, the healthcare and public health sector especially the supply chain have been consistently tested over the last year. Like I said, we responded to 27 distinct events, and that's just in the US because we're a domestic focused organization. So I'm sure a lot of our multinational partners faced even more, but we've seen kind of the true variety of events, from wildfires, cybersecurity vulnerabilities, and then indirect impacts from things like the Colonial Pipeline shutdown. So I think I'll say that the tests have been constant and difficult, but I'll say that supply chain stakeholders have been able to maintain a significant amount of flexibility to adapt to changing situations. That's allowed them to ultimately be quite resilient in the face of all of these often overlapping threats. So I think flexibility is a huge piece of most supply chain stakeholders, especially on the manufacturing and distribution side. It's a huge part of their planning, kind of being able to build adaptability into their plans of, all right, how will we be able to flex? Are we going to be able to surge production if there is an increase in demand, which we definitely saw. Manufacturers continue to surge production for things like PPE, products like needles and syringes to meet demand for vaccines, as well as bringing new capacity online in really short amounts of time to meet that demand. I'll note that to keep that kind of increase in capacity going long term, really do need to have strong communication and partnership between public and private sectors. I think the more government can communicate how they're going to be looking to private sector stakeholders, especially on that manufacturing and distribution side, to build preparedness and kind of the capacity that government think will be needed to respond to future events. I think the more we can do that, the better. And it helps these companies direct their investments in an even more targeted way. So again, I think the healthcare supply chain has largely remained resilient, even with all of these major disruptions. But kind of like I mentioned, there is that need to address longer term, more systemic issues of worker retention and kind of the broader things that we need to make sure we're addressing to remain resilient.
Great, thank you. Brandon, what has FSISAC done to engage and assist members in responding to physical events like COVID-19 and hurricanes, for example, like Hurricane Ida this past year? I think you're on mute still.
Always, I'll get that right next time. Sorry. So obviously the vast majority of what we concern ourselves with is cyber, but physical does have a pretty large impact on our members, as you can imagine, especially at the community institution, credit union type level. So we do concern ourselves with that quite a bit. So we have a few things that we do. First, we have close collaboration with the what we call the tri-sector, right? So that's financial services sector, electrical subsector, and communication sector. So we work with them quite a bit. In fact, we just had a call with them earlier today to talk through potential events, global events happening. So and what we might do together in terms of that. So we have a tri-sector playbook that we've put together that sort of dictates how we would cooperate, or rather lays out how we would cooperate and talk, and what kind of calls we would have and when we might have those calls and what type of information we would share with each other. So we are able to very quickly share information coming out of the electrical sector and the communication sector with our members, which, as you can imagine, in the case of a physical event, is incredibly important information, because those are just about as important as sectors get for that type of a thing. So we're able to share that information out pretty quickly, vet information, and then share it out as well. We also have some other reports. We work with Visa and MasterCard, and I know, Denise, you know something about this, being a veteran of the financial services, ISAC. So we work with Visa and MasterCard early on. If a hurricane's coming, this would be pre-landfall. So we're already talking to them, thinking through getting reports for them for what's still working, what's not working, and being prepared for that. So we're looking at where a hurricane might hit. We're saying, okay, and once it does make landfall, then we're immediately starting to get information from them about, if you think about it, point of sale is a great way to determine where you still have power, where you still have communications, and where you're still able to continue operation. So we're getting that information in and feeding it to our members so they're able to see, even if at the branch level, what is working, what is not working, who has internet, who has power, et cetera. So that's also of interest to our partners in the public sector, FEMA, CISA, et cetera. They can take a look at that and very quickly be able to determine where infrastructure is working. So sort of from a beyond financial services aspect, I think that's fairly useful and to our members as well. But again, I think that tri-sector is really of key importance when it comes to helping with physical events. So those are reports that we wrap up and are able to distribute through our network. So really quickly.
Thanks. So Eugene, I'm going to pivot a little bit to cyber. And we touched on a little bit here about third-party risk. And, obviously we had a number of incidents this last year where, for example, we had Extelion on the cyber side, which was a VPN, and also not a VPN. Oh gosh, I went blank there. But and then we had Log4j in December. We had SolarWinds at the beginning of the year, end of the year in 2020. And a number of other huge vulnerabilities that happened in the cyber world, just like supply chain. Oh, Microsoft Server for another one, Exchange Server. So how did you inform your members? How did you make sure that they were aware and knew what to do? And what key actions could your members take to help strengthen their cybersecurity posture or build a cybersecurity program?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so I definitely, it was interesting because each time we have a mass event like that, where it's a really popular product that tons of people are using, or it's exposed to a huge portion of our community, we try to get on it as quickly as possible and get out information, whether it's at first like an advisory on the vulnerability. And then if there's no information on a workaround or a mitigation at that point, it's happened in the past that we've had to let people know about it and say, stay tuned for actual actions you can take, or a patch that may not exist yet for something that's like a 0-day. So we start with that. And then one of the big strategies we had was with Log4j and with some of the other bigger vulnerabilities out there, we've actually stood up a standalone like page on our website that's like a hub for all information on the vulnerability. CISA information on it, partner information from around the cyber community, workarounds, if needed, guidance on patching and implementing mitigations in cases where you're not patched. So we pulled all that stuff together. We put up information where we could and put that page together really quickly. And we held an emergency call with our membership. And I actually see in the comments, Ren Isaac did the same, and we had members starting to suffer from alarm fatigue. It's for the really serious ones. Sometimes you've got to pull together something like an all hands call where it's, if you want to learn more about this, come hop on this webcast, learn about this. Here's a web page, so we're not just flooding you with emails where you can go for resources. CISA stood up a page. Other partner ISACs did so. So that was a really big, that's a really big strategy we've pursued for the last few years, and we've done it for a few of the larger vulnerabilities and mass events. And then, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the second part of your question.
Yes, so the second part of it was how can organizations strengthen their cybersecurity posture or build their cybersecurity program?
Oh, excellent. Yeah. So I would say in relation to those big happenings, I think the best thing they can do is, it is fatiguing to ingest information like that constantly, like alert information, but it's really important to find a way that works for you to look for alerts on products that you use that might be affected, or things that you're exposed to. If you can laser in on those key critical things, like maybe take stock of what products you use, inventory that, what software and what hardware you're using, et cetera. Try to laser in on that, and really also build a patching management program. That's really so important. Just keep things updated. I know in some of these 0-day cases, you're waiting for the patch when it's being heard about and exploited in the wild, but it makes a big difference. And we still see people time and time again that don't have a patching cycle that's acceptable. And then for building a more resilient program, a big thing that I always advocate for, and I don't have the number off the top of my head, unfortunately, is when we looked at our cyber assessment data for the year from those roughly 3,000 governments, when we looked at just those people, they were showing that people who had a framework they adhered to or followed as some form of guiding star for their cybersecurity program, they were scoring on average over 50% higher in maturity. And so I think like it's cheesy to say this, and I say it in all my presentations, cybersecurity is a big sandwich. You have to eat it a bite at a time. There's no way that you can do everything at once unless you have all the manpower and all the money. So I recommend a framework, just something that works for you, that you can take one piece at a time by criticality if you can, implementing mitigations, implementing controls, implementing processes.
Thanks. One thing I was going to plug too for Health ISAC is that we, with the Log4j and other vulnerabilities, but particularly Log4j recently, on our website, we just put up a site where we have all the medical device manufacturers list what they're doing as far as if they're impacted by the vulnerability or not, or what, if they are, what organizations can do about it. So that's on our website at hisac.org if anyone's interested in that. Touching on this, I'm going to pivot a little bit on something that's been mentioned a little bit, Brandon. You talked about the geopolitical threat and tying that into information. I know over the holiday period, there was a lot of messaging that came out, talk about alarm fatigue from the White House, from CISA, from the FBI. There was a Tri-Seal product that came out from FBI, NSA, CISA, about, be sure that you're resilient over the holidays. And I don't know that message, they were trying to hint to a geopolitical threat that was going on that we're seeing now, and I know you're talking about, Brandon, how do you make sure that people get that message?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's one thing that ISACs do pretty well, right? And in general, especially when you have these structures put in place where you have that public-private partnership already set up and ready to go. So, we were able to, now I'm not in our GIO folks, our Global Intelligence Office, those are the folks actually consuming that information and packaging it up. But that, I did have a chance to talk with them a bit, and that's what they're doing, right? As they're getting information, they're consolidating that information from our public sector partners, from our members, and they're putting that stuff together in sort of a consumable format and then pushing that out to our members. So our members come to us to submit information or receive information through what we call our share platform. It's part of our intelligence exchange platform. This is something that we've put together. It's a platform that our members have access to where they can go in and actually choose the types of, to Eugene's point about alarm fatigue, et cetera, they can really choose the types of alerts that they want to receive, filter it that way so that they're not just getting blasted with everything coming out. But if this is the type of information that they're looking for, then certainly we would be consuming that, packaging it up into these briefs, so to speak, and consolidated packages, and then pushing them out on that platform or otherwise to the members so that they are getting that information. Also, so any of our members who are part of the groups I mentioned earlier, say the CERG, which is the Core Executive Response Group, right? That's sort of the C-level folks who get together and talk through these issues at a very high level. This type of conversation will happen there, and then it can trickle down to their organizations from there. We have the Business Resiliency Committee who meets pretty frequently, especially in the case of these physical type events. They'll get together and think through potential impacts of something like that on business resiliency, right? So what are the things we need to look out for? What are the potential impacts? And what do we need to let the sector know, right? So it's not, what does my organization need to know with a group like that, but rather, what can we let the sector know, and how can we better inform them about what to potentially expect if certain things happen. So I would say it's through those types of channels. We've worked pretty hard to get those channels set up in the past. Another part of that intelligence exchange platform is what we call Connect. And that's really a peer-to-peer communication, right? It's a sort of a private, where any of our members can talk to each other. They can create groups inside that platform. They can talk to each other. They can request certain individuals from other members to join them on that platform and talk through some things. So it's a good way for our members just to connect directly if they have questions that they actually want to go directly to another member for. It's a good way for them to do that. It's anonymous, it's private. So and secure. So that's another way to do it as well.
Great, thanks. Courtney, with the current threat environment with so many overlapping events, in play, how does the sector prepare for and respond to emergencies? And I know you mentioned you had over 27 that you responded to, so you've certainly seen that play out in 2021 and going into 2022.
Oh, absolutely. And I think I'm going to go back to some of the things that I think Brandon mentioned as far as, well, definitely relationship building, but also cross-sector information sharing. I think those are things that are critically important to make sure that we as a healthcare, public health sector can respond to whatever is in store for us. I think cross-sector information sharing is especially important for healthcare preparedness, just because of the level of dependencies in the healthcare sector. You need to know how energy is doing. Are people able to get power to power the manufacturing, to keep the lights on in the hospital? Is water available, because dialysis can't run without clean water? Transportation, how are people getting to work? Patient transport, how are deliveries being made? I think there's just so many layers of the cross-sector dependencies that you need to be monitoring in this, and particularly in this current threat environment with so many threats. So I think, to Brandon's point, that's another part of why ISACs are so valuable, is we're kind of taking in those cross-sector pieces, or at least monitoring them, and then sharing them out to partners, stakeholders who are responding, so that they're able to make the best decisions based on the full situation, to include what's going on in water, energy, transportation, and comms. So just wanted to kind of double down on the importance of that in this threat environment. I think relationships are incredibly important as well, partly because it is so hard to keep an eye on everything that's going on. You need to know that you've kind of got folks or organizations that have your back, as far as being able to know where you can go to get some type of resource. So can I go to FEMA to request assistance with a generator versus my local county emergency management? Kind of knowing where to go, I think, is so important, because you're not going to be able to do everything in-house. It's just not feasible, no matter how large of an organization you are. You can't keep your eyes on everything, and you can't do everything. So being able to work across the sector, across other sectors, and then across public and private, I think is critically important. So also part of why ISACs are helpful, kind of keeping trusted partnerships with groups like ISACs and AHC are so important for kind of situational awareness in peacetime as well, and in the preparedness side of things. I don't want to make it completely response focused, but as far as finding or understanding early notification of issues, kind of what's on the horizon, and doing some of what Brandon was also referring to, of kind of, all right, so what does this mean for me? We just got this alert from CISA or from some organization, and can you kind of translate that down to the bottom line up front? Like, what do I need to do? Is very helpful.
Great. I know we're kind of touching around this. We're dancing around this a little bit, so I'm going to throw this question out. And Courtney, if you want to take it first, because I'm going to throw it, I think, to all three of you. Do you think that government has a role to play in information sharing, and what would the role be, and how can we work with government when we're in these types of situations?
The answer is absolutely yes. And yeah, happy to kind of kick off the responses. I think one we've alluded to that is important for government to play a role in is kind of cutting through misinformation and getting the information from them where it's information that can't come from anywhere else. So I think kind of maintaining the relationships and the fora that government does to share information. So the CISA alerts are a huge one, especially on the cyber side. On the physical side, and in terms of COVID, I'll give the example of CDC clinician outreach and communication activity calls, or COCA calls, and for more generally, the NBEOC calls, National Business Emergency Operations Center. So for like that, and maintaining those is just so important for us to be able to prepare and mitigate against whatever is coming down the line. And so I think also, kind of as much as possible, given regulatory and business constraints, I think government should leverage healthcare stakeholders in particular to test and like preview messages or policy that could be coming down the line. I think I'm talking more in terms of long-term responses like COVID or kind of supply chain resilience, of saying government being able to go to private sector and saying, we're thinking about this policy, like how will that impact you as far as your ability to maintain production of one type of critical supplies? If we're going to be asking you in the future to up your production of PPE, for example, of masks, is that going to impact your ability to create gloves? I think that's a bad example because there's not a ton of overlap, but I think kind of being able to avoid that type of negative and unforeseen impact is something that government talking to private sector more ahead of policy coming down the line, even if it can't be changed, even if it's something like this is coming, this is what we decided based on the research we've done, but using private sector as a way to disseminate that to kind of their employees and the public and giving them a bit of a heads up or as much as possible is helpful for communicating information in a way that's more easily understood. So I think the short answer is yes, 100%. Government has a huge role to play in information sharing.
Great, thanks. How about you, Brandon? I know you've got a little bit of a perspective on that.
Yeah, definitely. Let's say you're talking, in the context of incident response or something like that. Obviously, when we stand up these groups that I was alluding to earlier, we kind of selfishly demand that CISA and others show up and tell us what they're doing and all the information we need to know. Courtney made a great point, which is that they're going to have information that just only they're going to have, and there's no other way for us to really get it. We're working with them pretty aggressively, always to make sure that these are very robust connections that we have, both at the unclassified and the classified level where we can, to get that kind of information, and then seeing what we can and can't get out to our members, and being sure that they have all the information at their disposal that we can possibly get to them. One thing that I think where the exercise program can be useful from a sector perspective is when we do these exercises, we're always sure to invite our public sector partners into those exercises to play with us, because it's a great way to work out the kinks in that type of communication, right, during these exercises, and really, frankly, to get on record how we would do that, and to say, hey, yeah, in this type of a scenario, here we are in a tabletop exercise, we're going through this type of scenario. A cyber attack, whatever it may be, we would probably stand up this group. It does have you guys are on it, public sector partner A, B, and C. You guys are part of this, and you will be briefing on what you know, correct? Yeah, we would do that. Okay, good. So in real life, that's what happens. That's kind of the expectation. So I think the exercises can be very, very useful in that sense, and just being sure that we all understand what it is we're looking for. They're asking us for information too. So we're sharing as much information as we can with them. It is a true partnership in that sense. So there is a extremely important role for public sector to play, and we try to take advantage of that as much as we can.
And Eugene, obviously you have a perspective as well, coming from multi-state, but also touching on the misinformation. Obviously that's a huge issue in the election space. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I guess overall, from just the information sharing perspective writ large, it's we've done similar stuff, like having for like Log4j call, when we pulled everyone together for the emergency call, we had a CISA representative come on to brief what they knew, and they were able to share. That was super valuable. We follow that as much as we can. If we can bring in an expert from them, echoing what Courtney and Brandon just said about that, they know stuff that we don't, getting their perspective, getting their intelligence, their information, whatever they can share to help our community, they bring to the table, and it's always so appreciated. For the upstream, like us sharing up to them side, when allowed and when permissible and okay, it's important to get information up to them about where incidents are happening, how they're happening from the cyber perspective. One of the things that helps is it can help direct resourcing or national direction on where programs and services might go to help communities that need assistance with cyber. So that I think helps inform their activities. from the misinformation and disinformation perspective, we've seen fantastic work at the elections infrastructure ISAC, where we've had people come together during national level elections or primaries at the state level and things like that to open situation rooms that CISA has given us a platform for through the Homeland Security Information Network. And in those situation rooms, people are sharing, it did this tweet that went out that said that polls open the wrong day. Like that's a problem. Like we need to get on that. Like seeing information shared where, whether it's in the mis or disinformation category, bringing it to light, bringing it out, letting everybody know who's collaborating in that room space, whether it's from the federal partner level, our level, or the counties and the boards of elections and the state election level entities. That level of information sharing on misinformation and disinformation has proven invaluable, really helping people stay on tune. We'll hopefully see some movement and formalization of possible programming and services related to misinformation and disinformation. To the best of my knowledge, though, I work mostly on the cyber assessment side here. I've seen, though, that the power of the situation rooms and the ad hoc sharing on stuff like that.
So Brandon, you touched a little bit on the exercises, and I kind of was going to pivot to you on this one. And there was a question that had come in from Amy Green about how do you get organizations that express downtime and third-party vendors or the extent of the emergency planning. What internal steps or things can you do? And I immediately thought about exercises. And so I know you're in charge of exercises for FSISAC. How do you use exercises to help with those kinds of things or help their members in their resilience strategies?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's really what exercises do best, I think, right? So for example, as I mentioned earlier, we have the Physic Exercise Committee. That's sort of the primary venue in the financial services sector where we get together and think through what type of exercises do we all want to or need to do together? What are the key issues that we're facing as a sector? Obviously, many of our member firms have their own exercise teams. They do their own internal exercises, but there is this place for this sort of sector-wide coordination. And that's more or less, at least in the United States, that's where we do that. It's the idea with exercises is you get together, you think, what are the big challenges to the sector, right? So you pull planners together, you start thinking through scenarios and the questions you want to ask. But really, in the end, an exercise is more than anything an opportunity for participating institutions to really take a look at what they do and how they operate in the context of these types of scenarios. So there is the higher level piece of how are we coordinating across the sector, but also to get there, they need to think through, well, what are our internal mechanisms? What are our internal plans, policies, and procedures that are allowing us to even do that in the first place, right? So we always encourage, as part of the planning process, the participating agencies to think through we have the overarching objectives for an exercise, then we have what we call sub-objectives, right? So those are yours. You own those sub-objectives if you're a participating institution. So you've come here, you're part of the planning team. What do you want to accomplish? What does your firm want? What does your firm need? And how can we accommodate that? Do we need to change the scenario a little bit? Can we tweak it? Can we add something to it to help you do that? So that's something that I think good exercise planners are always looking to do. It's just make sure that every participating organization gets out of that exercise exactly and everything that they need. So it's just really baking it into that. So I think the financial services sector is fairly mature as far as exercises go, which is, I think, great. We have more things that we're looking to do in the future as far as bigger things, like we're looking now, beginning planning for a large functional exercise probably in the fall, and we'll be able to test a lot of these things. But even at the simple tabletop or drill level, to your question, those are great opportunities for participating organizations to jump in and think through and go back and ask the questions ahead of time, right? As part of planning, what do we want to look at? What do we need to know? What can we get out of this exercise? Even though it seems like we're only talking about these things at a sector-wide level, or from that perspective, it's not really always the case, right? It's there, but again, we want people to look internally and think through what they're doing and how that can help. Because of course, well-functioning member firms make for a better functioning whole sector. So that's kind of how we look at it, if that answers your question.
So I'm going to throw a little tidbit out there that I don't know if you know this or not, but and this is where you said FSISAC and the financial sector has been pretty much on top of the game when it comes to exercises. when I joined the FSISAC in 2007, they actually were just conducting, and they did it with government, the physic and Treasury, a pandemic exercise before people were even really looking at it. And they did a really extensive one, and there were a lot of lessons learned for that. So that's really that's a little tidbit of information there.
Well, and I would add, Denise, that that's the first time I met you. Is I think when you were there, you were quite ahead of the game. We met back in, I think, 2009 for an exercise, right?
Right.
Going together for the members at the summit. Yep.
Yeah. So, Courtney, I'm going to ask you a question, and then I see that we have about 10 minutes left, and I'm watching to see if anybody has any questions. So feel free, if you have any questions, to drop them in the chat. I'll make sure we answer them if we can. But Courtney, what strategies can be used to build supply chain resilience for future events?
Sure. So I think one thing we can do is take advantage of opportunities to kind of codify best practices that we've seen as far as information sharing across the last really 2 years. I think a lot of the information sharing that we need to do at this point can happen within the healthcare and public health sector structure under the Critical Infrastructure Protection Advisory Council structure, and kind of just thinking through where we can centralize collaboration, coordination. I think at the local level, it's going to have to be a bit more specific and differentiated, but that's as far as the federal level or the national level. I think that there's an opportunity to take the things that we already have and continue to bring them forward. And at the local level, I think there is an opportunity to codify things we've seen that worked. I'll give an example of during Hurricane Ida, gas availability was a really major issue given disruption of local sourcing and the market as a whole. I know we saw, I think, over 90% of crude oil and natural gas production in the Gulf of Mexico was shut down for a while after Ida. So it became really, really important for there to be an understanding of how gas, both for generators and then for folks trying to get to work, were being prioritized and who was in charge of that at that local level. So I know FEMA ultimately worked with Louisiana Homeland Security Emergency Management to kind of get a process in place for that, which was kind of a huge, I don't know if they had done that before, but kind of creating those structures and knowing where to go for information, like how do I get prioritized for gas? Like, am I as a health sector worker able to get gas for my car so I can get into work? And just being able to know where to go for that kind of question is huge. I'll also say kind of just keeping the momentum and maintaining relationships built in the last year plus of events is huge. And then kind of finally, just communicating in terms of preparedness and resilience instead of purely response, I think is something that the healthcare and public health sector and supply chain should do, probably all sectors, kind of just thinking of how do we build a system that's not preparing for the last disaster, but is flexible enough, kind of going back to that piece of how supply chain has been able to maintain resilience. It is a lot of that is flexibility. So how do we maintain as a sector flexibility so that we can meet the need no matter what the hazard is that we face so that we can continue to care for patients. I think at the supply level, it's what are the concrete steps we can take to ensure that we've got the partnerships that we need to make sure that the needs are met. And I think those are the kind of the questions we need to keep asking and working toward to build resilience for future events.
Great, thanks. So I do see that we have two questions, actually maybe a third one too. So Sarah had in the chat here about doing blended threat exercises, and I know RenISAC has been doing a lot of that and a lot of good work in that space. I know at Health ISAC we've been doing a lot of that as well. And then Brandon, there was also another kind of exercise question around exercises tend to focus extensively on operations, but is there a way to look at the logistics side and what is being done to ensure logistics, especially long lead time requests, are functionally exercised, even full-scale tested during emergency exercises? Would you be able to tackle that maybe from some of your broader experience, not necessarily financial services, I guess?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Joel, and not incorrect. A lot of times we tend to focus, particularly when you're at something like a tabletop or discussion-based exercise where you have very limited time and you have a certain audience there, you've sort of targeting or focusing on something at these sort of response level, you say glazing over actual logistics, right? So we haven't, to be fair, and I don't think we're alone in that, spent a lot of time looking at strictly logistics with our exercises, and perhaps that's a mistake. I think one thing we're trying to do, to your question, is we are recognizing things like that, and we are expanding the scope of the things that we're looking to do in the future. I mentioned we're going to be doing some functional exercises in the fall. This is probably something that would likely fall under that type of a category where we actually have a multi-day exercise. We have the ability to craft a scenario that actually is able to scope something like that into it, logistics concern or otherwise. I would say now probably the individual firms, especially the large ones that have their own internal exercise teams, are probably looking at logistics internally. I would say that's probably almost certainly the case. From a sector-wide perspective, we could probably be doing a better job at that. And to your point earlier, Denise, I mean, back in my previous life when I was kind of looking at all hazards exercises of all types, that was certainly something that was always in play. That we wanted to take a look at, particularly when it came to emergency operations and emergency response, what boots on the ground. So logistics is very, very, with a physical event, particularly, that's of top concern. So we're trying to figure out how to translate that a little bit into our world over here in financial services, but that is something that we're actively working on.
Great. And then there was another question. I'm going to direct it to you, Eugene, see if maybe you want to tackle this one. What is your biggest fear? A gap in the system that currently does not have a process to support resiliency?
I guess, like, if I had to sum it up, my biggest fear is for those organizations that don't have someone who can handle their cyber affairs, because I know this is an old phrase. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. They're off on their own. So that's what really scares me. It also scares me when I see organizations that have large digital footprints that are not patching their systems. That's a huge fear of mine. I mean, it's actually not the crazy new tech that they're lacking. There's some basic cyber hygiene practices that a lot of the community just still hasn't adopted yet, where we have a lot of work to do. And I think that's probably what scares me the most is that whole swath of organizations that, even if they're spending 6 or 7 figures on solutions and things like that, they might have basics they're not covering. And that's a fear of mine.
How about you, Courtney? What do you think on that one?
I'm not sure if I have a specific answer. I'm still kind of thinking through that. My biggest fear.
I'll trigger one for you, maybe. So I know during the pandemic, obviously the vaccine and therapeutics manufacturing was huge, right? And one of the things that came out was during the ransomware attacks, how many huge manufacturers were dependent on a very small, like there was only one supplier of like a specific package for the vaccine, that the vaccine wouldn't get distributed if it didn't happen. And they were taken down. They were wiped out by a cyber attack, a ransomware attack. So I don't know if you would want to play off on something like that, but I think it's like almost not knowing how many people are dependent on one minor supplier.
Nope, you definitely did trigger one there. I think that is a great one, kind of lack of redundancy in the small things that we might not know about. I think we're thinking about redundancy in terms of probably some of the bigger stuff, like who's making the N95s. We have a lot more of those producers now, and we know where to go. But it's those unknowns that it's like, all right, this one person that's making, or this one organization that's making this tiny gasket that's needed for this medical device. And the second that we can't produce that, we can't produce this medical device. I think it's that type of thing. So I will definitely play off of that prompt and say, I will say, I know that there's a lot of work going on to identify those things, but it's hard because there are so many components at play.
So I know we're right about time. Anybody final 30-second thoughts? Eugene, you want to start?
Sure. I guess, I've said a lot about where my fears lie and where we've seen problems in the community. I would just say, get started on your cyber journey. Work with organizations that are smaller level, lower resourcing, work with the ones who need help, and find ways to engage the communities. And if you are the target of that community, start off on your path by charting out your first few steps based on the greatest areas of need.
Great, thanks. How about you, Brandon?
Yeah, thank you. First, thanks for having me here. I would say, the value, remember the value of the ISACs really is, again, a force multiplier for some of our small to mid-sized institutions. So whatever sector you're in, I would encourage you to take a look at the programs they offer, because there's probably something that would be of great benefit to you, especially if you don't have the resources to do all of those things by yourself. So take advantage of what they have to offer.
Great. And Courtney?
Yep, absolutely. Doubling down on those pieces, and specifically the importance of information sharing, and ISAC specifically in kind of getting the information needed when you need it. Also want to kind of repeat the importance of flexibility in, I think, planning for resilience in general, but especially in supply chain resilience, but being able to adapt to the need. And I'm kind of going back to a question I saw in the Q&A from Persia Payne Hurley of, I think there are some things that have probably changed that we've learned in the last year or two along the supply chain of things that work better, and kind of taking those things forward into future events, I think is important in building resilience.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Eugene, Brandon, and Courtney for participating today, and Sarah off on the side there in the chat. And thank you, Laura and Tom, for having us again. Hopefully everyone enjoyed the panel, and I thank you all for attending.
So much, Denise. Courtney, we'll see you on Thursday in our resiliency and healthcare session. Eugene and Brandon, thank you so much. Over to you, Tom.
Okay. Thank you, Denise and everybody. That was wonderful.